Welcome to yet another deep dive into the world of the Kachal. We are in Yoreh Deah. We are in the Shulchan Aruch Yoreh Deah. Siman Tzadi. We are in chapter 90. We are still discussing the first couple of Seifim here, Aleph and Beis. And we are learning some important Yesodos, some very foundational rules in Isser V'Heter. Even though we're talking about a cow udder, we've been discussing about what exactly is the halacha when it comes to an udder, meaning when you cook it by itself, you have to get the milk out and so on, but we're also learning about these other important rules that are necessary for understanding how we decide the laws, the final laws of the udder. So we've been talking a lot about, from the previous discussions, when we talked about cooking the kachal when it wasn't properly prepared to be cooked or to be roasted. We haven't talked about yet how to actually do that. We've been talking about a little bit about the actual state of it not being sliced and diced and cut open. Did you need it for roasting? Did you need it for cooking? And then we started talking about if you don't do the slice and dice and smash, that those things could create a problem of the mixture being prohibited, or sometimes the udder itself will be prohibited. We're going to go back and look at this whole idea of shishim. We said in the end of the last year we needed shishim against it when you cooked it with other meat. How do you measure that? And we talked a little bit about the Rashba and the Rambam and the Ramah. There's this big discussion about how exactly you come up with the 60 times thing. We know there's this rule of 60 times to eliminate flavor, but what are you including in that calculation? And so even though it seems like this is not really a super important section to learn about, we're really learning some very foundational rules in discussing the udder, so that way we understand better how to apply these rules to come up with decisions in later cases that are above and beyond just the udder itself. So let's look at that brisa that we brought up previously about measuring the kachal. Okay, so back to in Gemara in Chulin, if you look on 97b, Tzadi Zayin Amud Beis, Zok the Gemara, Amar Chanina, Keshehin Misharin Bereita Bekipo V'Chatichos V'Kedera. Okay, so when we talk about measuring, we measure everything that's in that pot. Okay, the juice, the gravy, the meat cuts themselves, everything that's in the pot, okay? Ika da amri, some also add kedera atzma. You also measure against the pot. Ika da amri, by the bala kedera. Some people say you also go against what's absorbed into the pot, okay? So we didn't really, this was a brisa that we saw earlier, talked about measuring shishim. This is the other half of it, Amechina's statement. And so what does this mean? That you are measuring with 60 times against all this stuff. So Rashi explains that when we're measuring against what is absorbed in the pot itself, he says if we see the piece of meat fall in, okay, and it doesn't cook so long that the volume is reduced, and we start to measure it against everything else that was cooked in the pot, based on the time that it fell in initially, okay, and we don't see that there's 60 times against that, we therefore estimate how much the pot has been absorbing from the permitted foods that were in there, okay, because at the time when it fell in there was a lot more, and some got reduced, and our assumption is it gets absorbed into the pot. That's how Rashi explains it, explaining that language. Okay. However, we don't measure the volume of the pot itself. And since the different parts of this statement of Rabbi Chanina disagree with each other, and it's something that touches on a Torah prohibition, therefore we are strict, and we don't use the volume of the pot to calculate 60 times. So how do we measure it? However it is when we first see it, and we don't measure against what gets absorbed into the pot, even though that was permitted stuff as well. Because the argument would be, well, the prohibited stuff got absorbed in there as well, so why would one and not the other? Okay, and we saw this, we see this later on. Rashi points out that it only absorbs permitted, not prohibited. Of course it does. Okay, so we don't use the pot to measure according to Rashi. And we also don't measure about anything that was absorbed into the pot. So not the pot and not what gets absorbed into the pot. Okay? We only use what's in front of you. So that's Rashi's opinion. And the Rosh echoes that. Okay? We'll come back to the Rosh later. And also the Shita Mikubatzes also says this as well. Now Tosfos has a question. He says, I don't understand. If you were to measure the thickness of the pot, okay, and we see the thickness of the pot itself is let's say it's 50 times, right? It's 50 units of measure. Okay, you need 60 so the Kedera itself is 50 units. Let's say it's 50 olive size. I think kazesim. I like to use that here. Let's say it's 50 of those. Now, let's say you then put water. That's 10 zasim. So now you have 60 zasim. And now you take something fat. You take fat, okay? So how are you going to, annul the flavor of the fat in the water? Okay? Of course the water is absorbing the flavor from this. Okay, so he doesn't like that understanding that you're using the actual volume of the pot. So Tosfos says, okay, so when we say that there has to be no obvious prohibited substance in there, the prohibited flavor was absorbed in the pot, okay? And we know from the previous usage it absorbed 1 kazayas of prohibited flavor, okay? And it was absorbed into it. And now it's going to absorb, permitted flavors. Now you're going to cook in it again. So we're going to measure against the pot to spread out that prohibited flavor and say it's no good. So Tosfos has a different way to learn it altogether. Okay, so the Gemara further says that if you have a case of where fat falls into a large basket of meat, Rav Ashi says that you measure against what is absorbed into the basket itself, assuming everything is hot here. Okay, so this was some type of hot basket. So the rabbis say that Rav Ashi is absorbing only permitted and not prohibited, so they don't know why you would measure against the basket. So Rashi says that Rav Ashi wanted to measure the following way. You measure the permitted volume and also whatever is absorbed into the pot itself in order to nullify the flavor of the prohibited substance based on how it looks right now because it's been sitting there for a while. So maybe it's been reduced. And the rabbis say, who are the students of Rav Ashi, is it only absorbing the permitted flavor and not only the prohibited one is being reduced? So why would you try to argue that there's more from before times? So the Ron goes back and looks at Rashi's opinion, and he says that his explanation of the Kedera itself was to use the actual volume of the pot and the material of the pot itself. So the pot itself is going to do that. And so when you're talking about the second half of it, that is what's getting absorbed into the pot, so that's only going to be absorbing the flavor itself, but not the actual material of the pot. Okay? So if that's the case, then when we see it right now, even though there's less prohibited substance in there, what we're going to have to say is that, it's gotten absorbed. So even though there was room to think one way, there's room to think the other way. Now, the Rashba disagrees with this. Now, Beis Yosef quotes the Rashba, but not in our halacha over here. He quotes it in Sadi Tes. So the Rashba says that there are some people who say that the Gemara is saying the following thing. That when we're saying measuring against the pot, that's actually a stringency. Okay? You only measure what's inside the pot and not what's absorbed in the pot. And according to this, then you only see what comes in front of you, which is similar to what Tosfos is basically saying, is that it has to be something that's actually right there. And if you don't see it there, you don't know what it is, then you can't measure against. The lenient opinion is saying that you can measure against what you don't see too. Okay? And therefore the Rashba says that we're going to take the second half of that statement, and we're going to say that you can assume that what's inside of the pot is going to make that less. Okay? Now, if it shrinks through cooking longer before you notice it, then you don't add anything else to it. Okay? So, other Rishonim also take a stance on this. The Rambam says that, he says this in Machal Suros, chapter 15. Okay? He says that when you measure all Isurim, whatever it is, if it's for 60 for flavor, if it's 100 for truma, right, or if it's 200, so you measure against the soup and the spices and all the vegetables and whatever gets absorbed, and also whatever gets absorbed in the pot, okay, because the prohibition falls in there, and you have to make a good adjustment based on what you see, because you don't know what was absorbed inside of it. So the Rambam is saying that you have to take the second approach, which is that you just don't know. Okay? And the Aruch HaShulchan actually has an interesting thing over here as well. He says that the reason why it's also being lenient might be because of Tam Ki'ikr, where we also say, which we haven't really discussed this much, but because we say that the flavor itself is not the same as the actual thing. The rabbis are just strict to say the flavor is just as prohibited as the actual thing. But since we don't know the volume of the flavor, therefore we can be lenient. Okay? Okay? However, we might argue that if we were to take into account that it was a Torah prohibition, like many of us seem to hold, then maybe you should say, that you should do that. Okay? That you should actually be concerned about what's absorbed in. So the Beis Yosef here makes the point that says that the Rambam is saying that when you say you have to measure against the stuff that falls into it, like this case of the fat that fell into the giant collection of meat, so he's saying that you're going to measure what's there, whether it's to permit it or to prohibit it. You only measure what you see right now, and not what you thought at the time. Okay, and so therefore, back to our case by the kachal. Okay, we say the kachal is the same as other prohibited substances. Okay, so that's the Beis Yosef's opinion. Now, the Bach says that I don't understand why the Rambam says that we measure with other prohibited substances by what gets absorbed into the pot, but not by the case of kachal. Okay, so maybe in that case it doesn't actually have less prohibited substances now than then. Okay, so then he's arguing that the Rambam is not clear about the udder. The Pri Chadash, however, says that the Rambam is saying that it depends on when you have your knowledge of when the prohibited substance falls in. So the Rambam is introducing something new to us, which is you're supposed to measure when you first see it. But if you see it fall in, didn't measure it, and come back to it later and see that it's changed, okay, then that's the question of, do you use what gets absorbed in the pot? And at that moment now you're coming to say it's permitted, and you can't use what's absorbed in there because you're going to have to say that it was equivalently going in. And so, therefore, in our case, when it comes to cooking an udder with other things, you just don't know. Okay? So, that's a stringency that we take by kachal. And you always measure by what we see the kachal is right now. And by other isurim, that's not the case. Okay? However, the Beis Yosef says that he takes a different approach than that. And he says, no, we have to measure it right now. Okay, so this is really a problem with it, which is, if we kind of know about the Isser beforehand and only are dealing with it now, and we see the volume has changed, how do we assume what happened with the volume of the stuff that came before us? So the Tur, when he says how do you measure in Sadi Test later on, he says you judge it right now. Okay, even though you knew that beforehand there was more, and you know that there's less now, you still only measure against what you see right now. Okay, because you could make this inference that what was there before and what's there now may both be equivalent. Okay, and the Rashba that we quoted earlier says that you try to make a little bit of a guess about what gets absorbed. and then you can add that to the heter there. So he makes a distinction between if it's the same flavor, in which case that would be, that would be Balta Barov, and that's why you're lenient. But if it's different flavors, okay, so that might be a problem, okay, and that's especially when the flavors are different. You can't be lenient like that, okay. And Tur also points out that his father doesn't make a distinction. So therefore, we were mentioning that there is a difference of opinion between Rashi, Tosfos, and the Rashba and the Ran and all the different people about what we actually mean in this sugya over here. And it comes out that Rashi specifically says that any flavor that goes into it, you should be strict about it. Okay, and that's therefore that takes that strict approach. And that seems to be what the Rosh is arguing as well. But here are the four opinions, just to lay them out for you. So Rashi and the Rosh will say that when you're measuring, you're gonna take the Isser and the Heter as you see them right now, even if there's less in the pot now. Okay. So that's how we're gonna apply that. All right. And so therefore you have to argue that the one flavor and the other flavors, they all disappear at the same rate. The Tur, the Beis Yosef, and the Rashba are going to have this distinction between whether the flavors are min b'mino, whether they're the same flavor or they're different flavors. Okay, and only by same flavors can you take this leniency. The Rambam is saying that you apply this rule of the heter and the isser. If you kind of knew that there was kind of shishim against it earlier and there's less now, then you can assume that that's the same case now. Or if you know, so if you knew there was one time shishim, there's less shishim now, you can be lenient on it. But now if there's less than that, you can't measure what's absorbed in there. However, there are some people who say that only by Kachal was there a greater stringency, and that's what the Bach was writing, and so on. Okay. So does the Rashba also take that same approach as the Rambam, that if I knew there was Shisha at the beginning and there's came later on, does that also apply as well? So the Prima Gadim and Rabbi Kiva Eger say that the Rashba seems to imply that you had to know that there was Shishim initially, even though now there's less in the pot. So as long as at one point there was less, that would be fine. However, the Rashi was maybe been talking about where you never saw it until right now, and that's why you're measuring as right now. So even though it's been in there for a while, that's part of the problem. Okay? And the Bach is the only one who says that according to this, if you saw the Isser fall immediately, you have to see if there's Shishim immediately from what you see there. But if you didn't see at the time when it falls in and only notice now, you can't assume that there was Shishim earlier, and you have to assume that maybe now everything got less. But you shouldn't assume, but you can't necessarily assume that at the beginning. Okay? However, if you take that approach, then you reduce the dispute between Rashi and the Rashba, which is that if you are not going to measure what you thought it was at the beginning, only what you're seeing now, so you could go ahead and make that assumption that whatever I'm measuring without knowing there was some type of initial point of measuring is sufficient to permit it, as opposed to waiting to assume that whatever fell in initially is going to prohibit it. Okay? So that's his argument. So, however, the Prisha disagrees, and it's that seems to be the case. But we're going to see in a second the Taz and the Shach, they have their own opinion, which is that they're going to basically take the approach that you have to know what the volume was initially, then worry about the rest of it. Okay, so we're going to apply the rules in Sadi test to our rules over here in Sadi. Okay. So here's the deal. So in Siman Sadi tests, we say that you measure against all of these things. This is Sadi test Daled. This is 99.4. you measure against all of the stuff that's in the pot, okay, whatever's in there. And then you measure the heter and the isser as they are right now when I see it, even though there may have been more heter initially, because, you didn't. He's assuming that you didn't actually see it. You're maybe guessing this case, okay? And that's only when you have different flavors in the pot. But if everything's the same flavor, okay, and the same type, min b'mino, then even what gets absorbed in the pot could basically be applied to what's inside of it as well. Okay, but whatever has basically flown off doesn't count. Okay, so the Mechaber takes that approach in the Rosh that we just mentioned. Okay, and the Ramah doesn't have anything that doesn't disagree with this statement. The Taz and the Shach write in the name of the Marshal that the halacha is not like this statement. You have to measure right now whether it's ben b'mino or she'eino mino, whether the flavor is the same or not. You always measure right now. The Pri Megadim points out that you can be lenient in a case of great need to take this approach of having a general assumption that it was much more earlier, and even what was absorbed into the pot. Okay, but he's not so sure if that really should be the proper way to give the psak. Okay, so what do we say here in Kachal? Okay, so by Kachal we say you measure shishim like you do initially, and the Kachal, right? We say in the over here in Sif Aleph that the Kachal atzmum shespashal nasa kachatichas asura. When you cook it like that, so it becomes prohibited. The aim sharin bo ela kamoshahu be'esh nishpashel lo kamosha haya b'shas nefila. So you have to take the volume of it at the moment it was cooked, and not the way that it was later on. So the Mechaber seems to take this approach of Rashi, whatever it was initially. And if you didn't see the Isser initially, and you see what it is right now, then you have to go ahead and take the lesser of the two, okay? And you see that there's not shishim against it. You don't assume that what goes into the pot is the same as this over here, because you already know that there was a different number. So when you know there's a different number, you have to be strict. So we see that Kachal is impacted by halachas that we'll learn eventually later on. Okay, so the Madnei HaShulchan says over here, he says that there is, these rules are actually pretty straightforward. In the case of min b'she'eino mino, we're always strict when the flavors are different. Okay, so when you have other meat and you have water, you have other things, you're going to need 60 because the flavors are all different. Okay, so that's just how it's going to be. So even though in Sadi Tess we say that it could have been all the same flavor, but there's no flavor from the Torah, no prohibited flavors going into it, and so therefore there's leniency in those cases. Okay, so when you don't see a different flavor going in, then you're gonna be lenient. But here we have different flavor. We have the milk inside of the udders. We're gonna have a problem. Okay, now what if you don't know what was at the time of when it fell into the pot? And now that you're looking at it, you have shishim, okay? So if you don't know what that looks like from the time that it fell in, so you waited, like you saw it fall in, but didn't go measure it until much later, okay? And now there's shishim against it. You have 6 times against it. What's inside of it? You can assume that that's okay, okay? Even if with the flavors being different, on a Torah level, you can still permit it because it's not the actual flavor itself. You have to take out the prohibited substance. Okay, the Pri Chadash writes that when you have a Torah prohibition, if you don't know what the initial mixture measurement was, then you should prohibit it because you don't know what is going in and out of the pot, either into the pot or into the air itself, and so therefore you need to be strict. So that's his argument over there. In the Crazy Uplacey, he says it differently. He says that we are different. It's different over here, but he says that he makes the argument here in Sadi and not in Sadi Test. He says that when you measure against the whole kachal, you didn't slice it and dice it, you started cooking it, okay, and you know immediately it's going to start shrinking. So you know that the milk is coming out of it, and it's going to go all throughout the meat itself. So for sure, you're going to need 60 times heter against the whole kachal, because the mechaber himself is saying we only measure against what it was at the time that we started cooking it, and not right now. Okay? And that's because we were assuming that kachal is going to try to eliminate that flavor itself, and therefore is included in the count of 60. Okay? And now we're seeing at the end of it that the kachal has gone down and it was trying to fight the flavor going into it. And so therefore what you really need is that you have to assume the kachal is going to have to be almost 119 times the volume of this little bit of prohibited stuff. Okay? So, I'm sorry, you need 120 against it in order to eliminate it. So that's the volume that you would need in order to say that you have the amount against it at the time when it falls in. So 60 is not enough, you have to almost double it. Okay? So when we say that you're measuring against the kachal, what we're saying is that the permitted and the prohibited flavors that are here, and you don't have the flavor in front of you, then you're going to have to be strict in this case and require almost double the amount of volume. Let's take a look at these halachas over here that we learned in the case of kachal. And so we can move on to in our next class about what we actually do with cooking the kachal. So the way we understand measuring the kachal and other isurim is that we saw that the Rashi and the Rush, that you take a look at the measurement of permitted and prohibited substances at the moment when you first take a look at it. Okay? And you know that it has to be after it's boiling hot and it started to reduce in flavor and reduce in substance. That's when it absorbs the flavor too. Okay, so what we're saying is that according to Rashi and the Rush, that even though there's more heter at the beginning than there is later on as it gets absorbed, we're not going to assume that it gets absorbed into the pot. We're going to say, no, we have to be strict and say the flavor is going into the food itself, which means we look at it right now, okay, because the Isser is also getting absorbed, is what we said initially. Okay, now that would be on a Torah level prohibition, but if it's only a rabbinic prohibition, so we might say that there might be leniency over here. Okay, so there was that approach potentially, but the Rush is very clear that he doesn't make a distinction between mino and mino. Okay, that's what we say with that case. So the Tur and the Beis Yosef, they like to quote that Rashba between the mino and the mino. And we saw that if at the initial moment, maybe Rashi could agree with that as well. And so therefore, if it's only a rabbinic problem, you could be lenient with saying that maybe some flavor went in. And if it's a Torah level prohibition, you could be strict about that. With the Rambam, we saw the Rambam has different languages for other Isurim and a Kachal. So the Rambam, the way that we first understood it, is that you're going to measure the heter and include what's inside of the pot. Okay, if you knew there was 60 times the amount of it at the time it fell in, there's no difference between having a kachal and having any types of isurim. You only measure against. You're only going to measure against what you see right now, and not what goes into the pot, unless you knew there was more initially. Okay, and that's when he would say that would be fine, and that's just like a general rule. Another possible approach in the Rambam is that kachal has a special stricture on it because it's basar b'chalav, and so therefore we don't give that leniency of counting what's inside of it. Okay, so the question is, did this Rashba, can you use it b'shas l'chak or not? So we saw that according to Pri Megadim and Rabbi Kiva Eger, that you have to also assume there were 60 times at the beginning, and according to the Prisha and the Tur, right, the thing that the Rashba was talking about, that you didn't know anything about it at the initial times. So that's some of the rule over there. And then we saw also here at the end that according to the Kresi Uplesi, that if you're not going to count it, the kachal, according to the whole volume of it, then you're going to need almost double the amount of volume against it in order to get rid of the flavor, because the kachal itself is going to become a problem, especially if you knew it fell in earlier and are measuring against later. Okay, so So that's part of the that's part of the assumption. That would be part of the assumption. I don't know anybody passing like that place, but it's just an interesting problem. So next time we'll get into the dealios with cooking the kachal before we move on to more rules about it. But it's interesting to note that we'll come back to this discussion later again when we get into tzadi test and talking about in the Dins of Tairuvis about how we measure these flavors in the pot and in the mixture. It's not just a simple thing of like look in the pot and measure it. You have to know when it fell in and when it started to get hot and when it started to become reduced to the cooking. All the different things all apply. Thank you for joining us for this year. We look forward to learning with you next time.